What has changed in high-end audio market and industry after COVID-19 started?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think the world is a different place now than before COVID-19. I'm not sure that we understand how different the world actually is, but I think we feel that there are some changes. This is a complex question because we're talking about, first of all, there's a supply chain problem that all audio manufacturers have. So certain parts, certain materials are harder to get by. There's a big increased cost on raw materials. Aluminum has tripled in price in the last 2 years. There's also a labor shortage when it comes to machinists and people like that. A lot of people were older, they retired during COVID, they're not being replaced as quickly. So there's a lack of labor. Now, our target production cycle on Discovery turntable, for instance, this is the time where I tell our suppliers, let's start making the parts and let's go, and you'll have the green light to the time where we have all the parts and we can assemble a turntable. This target production cycle was about 8 months. Now we're looking to 14 to 18 months production cycle. So this is much longer in time.
Right.
So
Are the suppliers located in Montreal?
yeah, they are. But due to, let's say, materials availability and labor availability, we're looking at a much longer cycle of production, and we're looking also at a higher cost of production. So these are two problems that everywhere in the world people are experiencing right now, whether it's in the United States, Canada, in Europe, in Asia, everywhere we hear the same things. What is that going to do to the audio market? I think it's going to be that the cost of making these things is going to go up. And I think there's a certain model of business that's going to disappear. And the model of business of every 3 years we change the equipment, every 3 years can get equipment that's discounted 30-40% off. I don't think this is going to exist anymore. I think the margins are going to tighten because the cost of productions go up, unless the retail prices go insane, and then nobody's going to want to buy anymore. And I think that the consumers, the customers, are going to be looking for products that have a much longer cycle life within their system. So Kronos Pro, for instance, which is still being sold today, was introduced 12 years ago. That's a very long amount of time in the audio business. And when you look at other products, they have a life cycle of maybe 3 years.
Yeah. Well, you originally wanted to be limited, wasn't it?
Well, in production number, but I mean to say that this Kronos Pro is built for life.
Right.
There's no real reason not to keep a Kronos Pro for 25 years, unless you want to upgrade, let's say, to a Discovery, but a Kronos Pro will not become outdated because Discovery is there. It's still a really high performance, its performance is still contemporary because we have retrofittable improvements such as the tone arms, and we've done other things in the past, and the CPS and so on and so forth. So we've always kept the model up to date. It's just that there's something that is higher performance that we can't put back onto Pro because it's a completely different chassis. But Kronos Pro will still be a viable turntable in 20 years from today. So I think that the customer, the consumer, the audiophile will be looking for products that they can keep a lot longer and that don't depreciate in value as quickly over time. I think that's going to be the biggest change that COVID will have brought.
These days there are many different streaming services. What is your opinion on digital playback systems?
I don't have an opinion.
I mean, there are like titles, Qobuz. There are a lot of people using these streaming music
I think it's
services.
Great convenience. I think it's probably really good for shopping for new sounds, for new music. But you're sampling all kinds of different dishes. But to me, I only have analog playback in my house. When I listen to music, I never listen to it in the background. I only listen if I'm listening. When I drive my car, I don't have music. I like to listen to the motor.
You don't listen to anything at all?
If I'm with my daughter in the car and she wants to listen to the radio, it's okay, but she's listening to the radio. I'm not really listening to it. If I listen to music, it really captivates me. So if I'd be working and there's music playing in the back, I'm going to stop working and start listening. and I'm going to get distracted from my work. So I can't multitask. So I don't really have an opinion on these systems because if I'm going to listen to music, digital is not going to give me what I want out of my listening experience. That's my opinion. That's my taste. Other people might feel differently, and that's perfectly fine.
So when you listen to streaming service and you find it really good music recorded present days, would you go and purchase LP
Of that music, let's take an example.
Yes.
I have the last 3 records of Ariana Grande.
Okay.
Okay. Now, audiophiles may not relate to this, or they might relate to this.
Yeah.
But I have the last 3 records of Ariana Grande. They're produced digitally.
Yeah.
I think they probably sound better on vinyl than on digital because I think something happens when they transfer and they cut the lacquer. There's a little more of a gradual thing going on in the sound. Things get rounded off a little more naturally from the mechanical process. But
Or analog.
in a way, the digital sound gets reanalogized that it doesn't do with digital filtering or whatever, like D2A conversion. There was a D2A conversion, but then it's further filtered through the cutting of the record in the mechanical process. So I would say that I really like Ariana Grande. I'd like to meet her and talk to her. I think she's a very smart musician. I mean, some people might not like her, but I like her. And I think she's great. And there's certain records like that, like Yellow is another example that I've always liked the sound of Yellow. I also like Daft Punk. And on vinyl, it's great.
It's too sad that they separated.
Yes. But I like Daft Punk. I don't think it was as well produced as, let's say, Yellow. In terms of the vinyl transfer was not as good. So I don't have an issue with any of that. It's great.
You don't talk about Diana Krall?
I love Diana Krall, but my favorite album of Diana Krall is the Live in Paris. And the Live in Paris was all recorded analog. And this is considered one of the 10 best jazz live albums ever made. I think she's Canadian for one thing, but she also surrounded herself with the best musicians that are available in jazz today. She's got Jeff Hamilton on drums on Live in Paris. She has the great guitar player, Ray Brown, on bass. I mean, these are unbelievable musicians. So she really knew how to surround herself with the best. And some people like her, some people don't like her. They find her too commercial. But to me, I think that she's very viable. I find that Live in Paris sounds better than her other albums because the production was analog. And you can hear it. I mean, it's really, really good. In terms of the production, in terms of the sound engineering is fabulous on this record. I find at my house, honestly, 80% of the time I'll be listening to classical music. So, and if it's going to be classical, there's so many great recordings that were made in the 60s, in the 70s. So many great recordings, I don't really feel the need to hear the latest version of Violin Concerto by Beethoven, let's say. There's so many fantastic versions of that.
Present classical artists, they try to perform in their own way.
The music.
Yeah, right.
I think that was always the case. I mean, when you think about Glenn Gould, another Canadian, Glenn Gould playing Bach on piano, played Bach in a way that nobody played Bach like this before. So he made it his own. And so I think that was always the case. They might say that today they do it more than they used to, but I don't think so. I mean, you listen to Heifetz's version of the Violin Concerto of Beethoven, it's not the same as other artists. Herbert von Karajan had a certain way of conducting that was very different than Bruno Walters. But what is fantastic about previous recordings, when you think about Herbert von Karajan, this guy in a, let's say, 35-year career recorded 900 records. Every 2 weeks they were making an LP. Let's say over 35 years, every 2 weeks. So every 2 weeks the same recording engineers in the same hall with the same orchestra were recording a major piece of music. They were getting really good at it because of the repetition, the work together. In today's world, if they want to record something, they'll get a team together to record. The orchestra will be put together, or they use an existing orchestra, but they're learning this piece for that. And then the whole process, they're not as used to each other. They don't have the familiarity with the hall the same way they used to. I mean, you think about this, every 2 weeks. When we listen to music, we listen to more than the piece of music played by an orchestra in a certain hall. We also listen to the recording engineers, their art.
Right.
It's a little bit as if we were going to see an exhibit of photography on flowers, all great photographers, let's say, of history. And there were 100 pictures of flowers from all kinds of people, like Ansel Adams. And you would see this, and you're not just looking at flowers, you're looking at flowers through the camera lens, through a particular kind of camera, with a certain kind of film, with the state of the art of visual presentation of a certain era. And when we listen to recordings, we listen to the recording arts as well as we're listening to the piece of music. So there's a wealth, there was a golden age of recorded arts. There are still recordings being made today, but I'm not sure it will ever be to the level that it was at that time when DG was competing with Decca, and Decca was competing with RCA, and RCA was competing with Mercury. I mean, there was an enormous amount of resources and money spent recording classical music. They would make money with the Beatles, and they would spend it on classical music. And so we're inheriting all this wealth of material today.
So you really listen to a lot of classical music?
80% of the time, yeah. I would say 80% of my collection of vinyl, I have about 4,000 records. 80% of them would be classical.
What style and period?
Everything.
Everything?
Yeah, to me, I like everything from medieval to Baroque to the classic period to the 19th century composers to modern music. I mean, if there's something that I don't like, I don't necessarily discard it. I say maybe I will like it later. Maybe I'm not ready to understand this piece of music yet. Maybe I'm not educated. And this has been true in some cases. I used to really dislike Bartók. Now I like Bartók more than I used to. You know, not maybe everything, but and opera is the same way. Opera is the kind of music that requires a certain amount of time so that to accept this form. And people in the 19th century, they were going to opera every month or something. There was an opera season, and they would become acclimatized to this music over time. And I think to appreciate certain forms of music, it takes the time to educate yourself as to it.